All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our day of action. It's been an amazing series of events with really inspiring conversations and amazing, wonderful, badass queer women that have come and spoken to us today. My name's Miranda. I use they, them, theirs pronouns, and I'm the Women's Program Officer here at the New Haven Pride Center. Before we begin today's program, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scottiecook, Golden Hill Palgussit, Neantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place you are in. Find out more about Native lands at native-land.ca. Now, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's program. I'm also so excited to have you follow along with our Night of Action with Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut. This is a really awesome event, and we're excited to have you participate in this workshop. Finally, before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors who made today's program possible. A huge thank you to CT Humanities and Planned Parenthood for all of your support. Your support helps facilitate important events like these. If you would like to know more about sponsoring programs like these, please feel free to reach out. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Nick for coordinating our area style interpreting, and Chris and Adrian and Simone, and all of the amazing interpreters that we work with to make our programming more broadly accessible. Now I have the honor of introducing Tiara and Gretchen from Planned Parenthood Votes, some amazing women who I have had the pleasure of working with for so many years. All right. And I think I am out. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks, Miranda. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Night of Action with Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut. My name is Sarah Mack, and I am the Youth Organizing Specialist at Planned Parenthood of Southern New England.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be with y'all tonight. My name is Gretchen Raffa, she, her, and I am the Senior Director of Public Policy, Advocacy, and Organizing with Planned Parenthood of Southern New England and Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut.
In just a minute, we are going to get started with ways that you can use your queer identity and your queer story to take action in Connecticut, this legislative cycle, and beyond. First slide, please. And next slide. So the purpose of today's event is to provide participants with a foundational understanding of how their queer identity can be used to provide testimony and support the legislative priorities of New Haven Pride and Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut. Participants will also be given an overview of the intersections between sexual and reproductive health rights and LGBTQ+ issues. And on our screen, we have Megan Rapino, who is an activist and athlete on the women's national soccer team. Next slide, please. Our hopeful outcomes are that participants will be able to name the various types of legislative advocacy actions that they can participate in during the spring 2021 legislative session. Participants will also be connected to New Haven Pride and Planned Parenthood Votes email list to receive updates and ask for this upcoming session, which is in full swing, and also be provided with the basic overview of how a bill becomes law in Connecticut. We're actually going to talk about how to write your testimony and not about the basics of how a bill becomes law. And on the screen, we have Laisha Clarendon, who is a non-binary athlete in the women WNBA. I couldn't think about what those letters stood for, but is in a gender non-binary athlete in the WNBA. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it over to Iman for a policy brief.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm so excited to be on this fabulous panel tonight with wonderful organizers with Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. Today, I'm going to give a brief overview of some wonderful research that I've been able to partner on through the New Haven Pride Center. It's been a very wonderful experience to work with these amazing folks. And tonight, I would like to give just an overview of an advocacy brief that I authored in honor of International Women's Day that focuses on sociopolitical issues impacting trans people and especially trans women of color. Since it is absolutely critical that we acknowledge the challenges faced by trans folks in our communities today, and especially trans women in light of International Women's Day. And in my brief, in addition to covering these issues, I also discuss how community-based organizations like the New Haven Pride Center can effectively work towards change and best support trans communities. So my report covers 3 main categories of research, which are youth, incarceration and policing, and sexual and reproductive health. So before I dive into each of those 3 categories and my findings in greater depth, I want to give some preliminary background regarding how I approached this brief and also my own academic background. So my background is in political science, and in my studies, I especially focus on LGBTQ+ studies, and particularly LGBTQ+ public health. So that was overall the angle that I approached this advocacy research from, as I ultimately view a lot of the issues that were raised in this advocacy brief, such as incarceration and youth homelessness, as public health issues. I'll circle back and talk about that a bit more at the end. But overall, my main focus in this brief was identifying the major threats to the health and survival of trans community members today and discussing how we can start addressing those challenges. So in that vein, it's also critical to acknowledge that my research and research like it overall paints a pretty incomplete picture of the challenges facing trans folks and especially trans women in this moment. And I cannot stress enough the extent to which further resources need to be dedicated to the trans community, and also further research has to be done on these critical issues. And it's of utmost importance that we seek out and uplift trans voices. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and take a bit of a deeper dive into each of the sections of my research. So first, to begin with youth. Even within the LGBTQ community, trans youth are disproportionately impacted by systemic injustice. Queer youth overall are roughly 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. But even within that startling statistic, trans and non-binary youth are at highest risk. There are many different intersecting explanations for that overrepresentation, but a critical factor is the discrimination and transphobia that young people face at home and in school, which are environments that are supposed to be safe for young people, but unfortunately aren't for many trans youth. Studies have shown that trans youth of color are often disproportionately impacted by school discipline, for instance, and face harsher punishments than white or cisgender peers. And moreover, trans youth are over 2 times more likely to be mocked by family members on the basis of their identity. As a result, many trans and non-binary youth are left with few places to turn. And in this section of the brief, I really hope to underscore the need and urgency of creating trans-inclusive community spaces, particularly those targeted at youth. The data has overall made it clear that even compared to other LGBTQ peers, young trans people, and especially trans youth of color, are among the most vulnerable members of our community, and we need to actively and materially support them. And some of the advocacy strategies that our friends at Planned Parenthood are going to go over today can certainly help in advocating for political changes that will help make our world a better and safer one for trans young people to live in. To move on to the next main category of my research, which is policing and incarceration. Overall, there's a great data supporting disparate policing tactics and their disproportionate impacts on the LGBTQ community. What's overall less well documented in both social science research and public health research is the treatment of trans folks and especially trans women of color in carceral settings. And like the challenges faced by trans youth, this is another very critical area in which advocacy, and especially legislative advocacy and political advocacy, can make a huge difference in the well-being and survival of trans women in our community. So growing evidence demonstrates that trans folks are too often criminalized and targeted simply for being who they are. And this is due in part to specific laws, such as sex work criminalization laws or HIV criminalization laws, and also very subjective and arbitrary policing on the basis of disorderly conduct, which is often used as an excuse for pretty explicitly transphobic policing tactics. Something that I discussed in the advocacy brief is the need to approach these issues with an understanding of systemic transphobia and the pervasive impact that it has on the lives of trans women. For instance, many trans women are persecuted for participating in survival economies, such as survival sex work. And the reality of many trans folks, and especially trans women of color, is that systemic transphobia has shut them out of opportunity and drives a reliance on survival economies. Moreover, unemployment rates remain disproportionately high among trans folks of color compared to white trans folks, which further demonstrates how systemic racism compounds with systemic transphobia to produce the challenges that are faced by trans people of color. In the brief, I move from there to suggest recommendations for addressing these challenges, and it's critical to trans folks' survival that we decriminalize sex work, decriminalize survival economies, and end arbitrary policing on the basis of conduct or gender presentation, while also simultaneously consistently making tangible investments in trans communities. We need to do everything we can to support trans folks and trans women of color right here in our community. And that begins with understanding their specific needs and what we can do as community members and organizers to meet those needs. So finally, the last category I want to discuss is sexual and reproductive health, which is the final category of the advocacy brief. So while disparities in health outcomes and healthcare access between the LGBTQ community and their non-LGBTQ peers are well documented in public health research, what is unfortunately left unaddressed far too often is the health discrepancy that exists between trans folks and other LGBTQ peers. The unique needs of the trans community are critically under-researched and unfortunately ignored by many in the healthcare industry. And in my advocacy brief, I touch upon a variety of health-related issues ranging from barriers to access to a lack of provider training and competency in trans healthcare. The denial of treatment to trans folks, for instance, is a horrific yet strikingly common phenomenon in healthcare. And research has pointed to particular difficulties faced by trans people in seeking preventative care, cancer screenings, and contraception provision. But even when trans folks are able to access healthcare, it is often not holistic or comprehensive. Without proper training, healthcare providers tend to make sweeping assumptions regarding the needs of trans patients. And a survey actually found that up to 50% of trans patients reported having to teach their healthcare providers about their own needs. With that in mind, it's disheartening, but rather unsurprising that many trans folks feel uncomfortable seeking medical care and often put off visits to the doctor. This is an issue that advocates and allies across the country must start to prioritize because we need to be doing everything we can to make sure providers are informed and that our trans community members feel safe seeking medical care. Regarding sexual and reproductive health specifically, research has found that trans folks are often at disproportionate risk of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And this risk is even higher for trans folks of color. It is critical that settings providing sexual and reproductive health care be intentionally trans-inclusive, and that providers in these areas are trained in trans healthcare. So overall, it's clear from the research summarized here and also summarized in the advocacy brief that our trans community members need our support, and that standing up for trans voices, and especially standing up for trans women of color, is necessary to their survival and well-being. It's my hope that this policy research, it does more than just paint a grim picture of the realities faced by trans folks. I hope that this can be a call to action, and it can remind all of us that we need to fight against systemic racism and systemic transphobia every single day, whether we are fellow queer people or allies of the trans community. In addition to advocating for policy changes and participating in community organizing, I also want to emphasize the great need that there is for further research. The data that we have on the experiences of trans folks, such as the data that I've been talking about tonight, is very telling, but unfortunately a great deal of it is outdated. A lot of the sources that I used in writing this policy brief date back to 2012 or 2014, simply because there is a critical lack of more recent survey data on the trans community. We really need more people to be doing this work. We need better and more complete data on what our trans community members are experiencing in this current moment. On a personal note, this is one of the reasons why I study data science, and I encourage anyone watching who may have an interest in statistics or data collection, especially if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, to do what you can to improve our collective knowledge of queer and trans experiences. research is power, and having better data enables us to create better solutions and organize more effectively. So that closes out my presentation on my policy research. With that, I will hand it back over to the wonderful speakers and presenters we have here tonight.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that wonderful and in-depth policy brief of some of the work that is happening in Connecticut that folks who are attending tonight can be a part of. Let's hop to the next slide, please. So let's talk about what is advocacy. We hear that there is a bunch of issues that are happening right now in Connecticut. What are some of the ways that we can advocate, or what is advocacy? What does it look like to be an advocate? I see some comments in the chat. I will let your brains think a little bit and wait for some answers to pop up on the screen. We also have Elliot Page featured here, who is a trans actor. Yes, I see a comment, using your voice. That is an example of advocacy. Attending a rally is another example. Going to a pride event, advocating for the rights for the LGBTQ+ community. Calling your legislator, sending them a letter, sending them a postcard, making sure your voice and the voice of others in your community are heard are all different forms of advocacy. Next slide, please. And on the screen, we have Ella Briggs, who is the former Kid Governor of Rhode Island. Yes, someone also mentioned fighting for others is another form of advocacy. What are the problems that are facing the queer community in Connecticut? We just heard this really amazing and in-depth policy brief from Iman. There's a ton of issues that impact the LGBTQ+ community. Are there any other issues, either on the local level, the grassroots in your city or town, or even on the full statewide level? And I'll wait for some more responses in the chat. Speaking up for broader issues and rights, using your experience to raise awareness. Great example, Sarah. Changes for support of the LGBTQ+ young people. Another great example. So we heard that there were also healthcare issues that impact the LGBTQ+ community, making sure they have quality, accessible, culturally competent, and sensitive care, making sure that we also look at housing issues from a queer justice lens, making sure that we know the folks who are impacted the most by housing insecurity are oftentimes trans folks of color. Someone also mentioned the conservative attack on trans athletes. Yes, and that's made some national news. The violence against queer and trans people. I know there are a couple of anti-trans laws specifically around trans athletes or young athletes in high schools in Connecticut, which can be really harmful. So those are some of the other issues besides what we talked about in the brief that are impacting Connecticut folks, and which are good ways to use your voice, your experience, and your story to focus on advocacy in your community. Next slide, please. So how do we advocate for change? Sometimes it can look like showing up wearing the same exact t-shirt as a bunch of other folks who care about the same issues. Sometimes it looks like joining a panel discussion and hearing the stories and learning how to tell your own story. Sometimes it looks like participating in a pride parade, or it looks like sharing your personal feelings and testimony on your social media platforms. It could be sharing an image. It could be making sure that one person in your family or your close group of friends knows what's happening in your community. These are just some of the examples that we can use to advocate for change at the state level. Today, we're going to get into a little bit more in depth on how you can use your personal story and use that as a way to advocate for change throughout the legislative cycle and beyond in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So, where do you use your story? In Connecticut, during the legislative session, there is a public hearing. During this public hearing is where you can make sure your voice is being heard for all of the issues that you care about. It's super important that your voice is heard, not only so that lawmakers know the different experiences and stories of folks in the community, but it's also a really good indication to show people that people are paying attention to the issues that are happening in their community. It's also a really great time for you to use your own personal story to explain why you support or don't support a specific piece of legislation in your state. Next slide, please. So how can we support folks through a public hearing? We are already underway in Connecticut through the legislative session. There are two really important ways that you can show your support this session and beyond. One is by showing up in person to testify, or via Zoom because of the pandemic, to testify in person to the committee. This is a really powerful way to make sure that your story is heard and that members of the community know who is going to be personally impacted. This makes it really personal and gives life and breath to the different stories and people impacted. Another great way for folks who may be shy or who have limits on time is to submit written testimony. It's another really great way to show that folks are paying attention to the issues and they care enough to write their own personal reasons why they care about passing or halting some legislation, particularly in their communities. Next slide, please. So, on the screen, we have Bet Porter, a character from L Word and Generation Q, and she uses her story in her saga to become the next mayor. Oh, yes. And I'm going to share a story of myself and how I got involved in the in public policy and advocacy using my experience as a formerly low-income Black queer person. And your story is going to be unique to you. It's really important that it comes from a personal perspective. And then it's not about getting into the nitty-gritty of policies, but explaining how you and your community are personally impacted. And there was supposed to be a really cute slide with pictures of baby me and young activist me and current activist me, but you can all imagine young baby face me and me shouting my testimony in the Rhode Island State House. So I grew up in the conservative Christian South, and I didn't see or hear of many people who shared my own experiences. I grew up in a community where there weren't many queer people. There were no openly queer people. And it wasn't until I got older and was in college that I had access to stories of queer folks who not only looked like me, but shared some of my background. When I first stepped into college, I had never received comprehensive, quality, culturally relevant sexual health education, let alone did I have any of the tools to talk about my gender identity, my sexuality, or my gender expression. These were all huge new topics for me. And on top of being in a new college setting with peers who seemed to be able to talk about the gender binary, that seemed to be able to talk about their queer experiences and their queer identities, and who were comfortable with terms like questioning and etc., I felt really isolated from my new peers. It was after my freshman year that I realized how far and how uncomfortable I was grappling with these conversations with my fellow peers. So I decided to start teaching comprehensive sex ed to high school students in my local city. It was through that experience that I realized how much I did not have growing up. I didn't come out until later in my college experience. If I would have had a comprehensive sex ed class, which had a teacher and a facilitator who was comfortable navigating many of the questions that me and my peers were having about gender, about orientation, and it being able to answer the questions in a safe environment about our bodies and about some of the bigger issues that we were grappling with. It was after teaching sex ed that I got involved in the reproductive health rights and justice space at Planned Parenthood. Through that experience, I really found out that I didn't see people who not only look like me in this space, but I didn't have many queer experiences or queer folks telling their stories and being a representative force in the reproductive health and rights space. From where I was standing as a newly queer person, it looked like a really heteronormative space with only folks who had traditional heteronormative intimate relationships. And so it really took me a while to find my own voice in that movement. It was after encountering more and more queer activists who were involved in abortion rights, who would share their own personal stories and experiences navigating the healthcare system using their queer identities and their queer bodies as examples of how we needed to have more inclusive conversations about reproductive health, rights, and justice. When I went to my first doctor's appointment in my junior year of college, I was having some really bad experiences with my menstrual cycle. It was the first time in my adult life that I ever had any problems. And because I was not having intercourse with partners who were able to produce sperm, I didn't even think it was a possibility for me to get on birth control. It wasn't until going to my local Planned Parenthood that I was able to have a conversation and was able to talk about the different options to manage the painful symptoms surrounding my menstrual cycle. And even as a queer person, it never occurred to me that I could go on birth control for something as simple as managing pain during my menstrual cycle. As I've grown through the movement of reproductive health rights and justice, I've been able to introduce myself and get to know so many amazing queer activists who are not only fighting for comprehensive and inclusive care, but who are fighting to make sure that queer narratives and queer stories are a critical part of what we're fighting for when we're fighting for reproductive health rights and access. It means fighting for reproductive health access for folks who look like me and for folks who are along the gender spectrum, who are gender non-binary, and who are folks who are going to feel comfortable and confident asking those questions to their primary care providers. I often think now that I am a little bit older in the movement, how can I use my story to show that there are queer folks in the movement and that there are queer bodies in the movement? What does it look like to be a queer body in the reproductive health space and rights movement? Why do queer stories matter in sharing about why we advocate for quality healthcare for all? And these are just some of the questions that over my time being in the activist space as a queer organizer have been able to comfortably navigate using my own story as a queer person who has needed to rely on reproductive health services to show that there are not only queer people who are in this space, but that having a queer inclusive lens is critical to making sure that we're providing the best care possible to everyone. So that's a little bit about my story and how I use my queer identity to advocate for issues that are close to me. Your testimony should be super personal to you. It should include how you came to it should include a challenge, a choice, and an outcome. Why is it important to share your queer identity, and how has it shaped how you view either sports, athletics, healthcare, or housing? Don't worry about explaining the policy. You just need to be an expert on your own lived experience. And you should focus on why this bill or why any topic is important to you and your community. It's really important that you keep a personal narrative and keep a personal aspect, because using your personal testimony is what is really going to show that there are real people every day who are impacted. Next slide, please. So, why should lawmakers listen to folks like us? Any thoughts in the chat? Play some Jeopardy music as I wait for responses. Yes, someone said because our voices matter. Yes, they work for you. They are your representatives. Yes, you are their constituents. You elect them to represent you. Next slide, please. So like folks said, you are their constituent and they represent you, and they want you to support them in future elections. You're also going to be personally affected by these issues. You're the expert on your own lived experience and how policy is going to shape your life. You also have really, really good, reliable information. Again, you are the expert on you and your community. This is why you should tell your story. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Gretchen, who will talk a little bit more about the legislative priorities in Connecticut.
Thanks, Tiara. And I want to just thank Iman for that incredible advocacy brief that she gave up front that really laid out some of the problems that people within the LGBTQ plus community face, and the importance of thinking about legislative or advocacy and policy solutions as one way to address some of the problems that our community faces. And I will just share with you that most of the work that I do is in the policy world around sexual and reproductive health care. And as a healthcare provider and advocate, Planned Parenthood's top priority is ensuring that all individuals have access to the health care they need, including the full range of sexual and reproductive health care. And that means regardless of who you are, your identity, your income, or if you have health insurance. And when we think about accessing sexual and reproductive health care, we know that people achieve true reproductive freedom when they have full autonomy over their bodies and their lives. And that doesn't just include healthcare. And I think, again, Iman really laid that out for us. It is really about the ability to live without fear or harm from discriminatory policies. And we know that the LGBTQ plus community is constantly under threat and harm from policy that is being proposed and passed at the federal and state levels across this country. We believe, again, that the accessing healthcare is a basic human right, and we work every day to ensure that there is an elimination of unnecessary hurdles and barriers for people to access that care. And we are committed to working towards a world and a place where no one experiences discrimination or violence because of their gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Thankfully, in Connecticut, we are, and I'm saying thankfully because we are, if y'all are watching what's happening across the country, many state legislatures are introducing anti-trans bills right now that are going to do incredible harm to the trans and non-binary community. In Connecticut, we have a General Assembly that is really pro LGBTQ plus rights. But at this time, we only have 3 out legislators in our General Assembly. So we also need to work towards electing more folks from our community to ensure that the people that are in decision-making, that have the decision-making power to pass laws, represent our community and the incredible diversity of our community as well. And I say that and say that there are still individual legislators in the Connecticut General Assembly that have introduced and are pushing anti-trans athletes bills this session. And again, thankfully, because we have a strong majority in the House and Senate and in our administration, we're going to be able to defeat those. But it takes each and every one of us to raise our voices and talk to our legislators, like Tiara sharing testimony, talking to legislators, and sharing your story is one of the most important things you can do during the legislative session, which in Connecticut we are in the middle of, and it goes to until June. So we have plenty of time to take action on some of our priorities. I'm only going to lift up a few priorities tonight so that folks get a sense of what our Connecticut General Assembly is working on that will impact our community, but this is not an exhaustive list, and we're going to share our contact info at the end and how you can get more involved. with advancing LGBTQ plus policies in Connecticut through the Pride Center, through Planned Parenthood, and other advocates across the state. One of the things that happened a couple of years ago, actually, the Connecticut General Assembly secured something really important, the first time that's ever been done in our country through the legislative process. We established an LGBTQ Health and Human Services Network, which the New Haven Pride Center is a part of. Planned Parenthood is a supportive organization in this network. This was a really important policy that was passed, because what it did was put money in the budget. There is a line item in our state budget now that is dedicated to our community and the health and human services needs of our community. And we are, as part of the network's work in the first year, we are going to launch a statewide, well, it's actually already launched, a statewide needs assessment for our community. And what's really important is that we get folks in our community, again, people that represent the breadth of the LGBTQ plus community. We want to fill out this needs assessment, because that's going to help us get more information about where we should be putting our priorities, not just legislative priorities, but funding, so that we can continue to ask the state to fund, the health and human services needs that are oftentimes in our community under-resourced and underfunded. So I'm bringing this up tonight because this is something that is in our state budget and it's proposed, and we need everyone that cares about our community to talk to our legislators about why it's so important to fund this network, because it's going to go right back into the community through organizations like the New Haven Pride Center that are directly working and serving the LGBTQ plus community. And then there are several bills that are that have been introduced in our session that will really work towards expanding access to healthcare. And there are a couple of different priorities, including offering a public option for folks in Connecticut to actually have access to more affordable, accessible healthcare. There's also a bill to expand Medicaid, and that bill will actually help folks that are now currently excluded from the state Medicaid program due to their immigration status be able to access the Medicaid program. There's also an important bill called the Connecticut Parentage Act, which was introduced, which will ensure all children have equal access to the security of a legal parent-child relationship, regardless of the circumstances of their birth or the marital status, gender, or sexual orientation of their parents. This bill is going to comprehensively update our current law to ensure state parentage laws remain constitutional and are protective of all Connecticut's children. There's also a bill introduced that will update our state forms and make sure that there's a non-binary gender option on all state forms. We currently have that option through the Department of Motor Vehicle, that there is now a non-binary option on our license. We want to make that uniform across all of the state forms. And we're going to continue to fight to ensure that, again, people have increased access to healthcare. And some of that looks like ensuring that people have access to healthcare through telehealth. A lot of people through this pandemic have been able to access their healthcare through telehealth for the first time ever because of loosened regulations because of the pandemic. And we know for confidentiality reasons and for barriers like transportation to providers, telehealth has been providing another option for people to access care. Again, these are just some of the policy priorities that we are advocating for, and we will be sharing more information afterwards. If you get more involved with how to take action, we can share a much more expansive list of policy priorities, but I just wanted to highlight a few tonight. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tiara, I think.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Gretchen. Let's hop over to the next slide. Thank you for that overview. Next slide. Yes. So here are some ways that you can take action and get involved in what's happening in Connecticut. You can contact your legislators by following this bit.ly link, bit.ly/find-your-EGCT, find your ledge CT. And you can also submit written testimony in support of the legislative priorities that we've highlighted tonight. There was a lot of information, but you can also join our email list so that you can stay in the know about what's happening at PPSC or PP Votes Rhode Island and some of the bills that we are tracking this session. Another great way to to get involved is share your personal story. Tonight, you heard my story, and we also highlighted some of the ways that you can use your story to get involved in the movement, either through verbal testimony at the State House or through written testimony. You can do that by following bit.ly PP Votes CT story. There are also a couple of petitions that you can sign. A petition for healthcare coverage for all, PP Healthcare Action, by following that bit.ly. And then again, make sure that you stay up to date with all the happenings at Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut by getting onto our email list and by receiving text alerts for issues that we care about and that we're tracking, and get connected to other activists who are also passionate about these issues. And then if you're not sick of us tonight, next month or this month, we will have our Wednesday monthly volunteer night on March 17th. Where you can learn and take action. Sometimes we host phone banks, sometimes we write to our editors, and sometimes we listen to the grassroots experts in our communities and hear more about the work they're doing. And if you are not sick of telling your story at that point, another great way is to write a letter to your editor of the local newspaper. Make sure that more people who live in your immediate communities hear your story and hear your opinions on what's happening in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So, who is ready to make some commitments to one of those things that we have that we had on our previous slide? Type it in the chat. We'd love to get a few folks to commit to telling their story. I'll dance along to Jeopardy music until I see some commitments. Yes, we have someone who agreed to testify at session. Someone to share their story and write testimony. Awesome. And what about a commitment to make sure you get onto our email list so that you can stay up to date with Planned Parenthood Votes Connecticut? You can put a hand raise in the chat or a plus sign. Also, we'll make sure that everyone gets all of those links after this presentation. And let's go to our last and final slide. Yay, we got one hand raised to follow us on social media and a check mark. You can follow us on all social media at PP Votes Connecticut, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also reach out to Gretchen and I with any questions you have. Our info is on the screen. Gretchen, do you have any closing comments for our folks who joined us tonight?
We need your voices. Again, I'm so grateful to be partnering with the New Haven Pride Center. And Miranda, thank you for putting together such a fabulous day. As someone that does legislative advocacy work every day, it is the public's voice that actually makes the change. You know, I can advocate all day long on behalf of Planned Parenthood and the patients that come through our health centers, but your individual stories and voices are so instrumental in getting policy passed, and legislators want to hear from you. They don't want to hear from Gretchen Raffa from Planned Parenthood. They want to hear from people that are most impacted by the problems that our community are facing. And we look forward to answering any questions. If folks have questions, we're happy to answer those. But we're just really grateful to, again, continue to partner with the New Haven Pride Center to advocate for issues that directly impact the LGBTQ+ community across Connecticut.
All right. I think I'm in to close this out. Thank you so much, Tiara, Gretchen. It's always a tremendous privilege to be able to learn from you, to learn from your experiences and your perspectives as amazing queer and trans women, organizers, advocates, activists within the community. Thank you to everyone watching for joining us for today's Day of Action. This is the last event of the day, so I hope you all got so much out of our 4 panels and discussions and conversations. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at women@newhavenpridecenter.org anytime for more information on policy and advocacy work for queer and trans women across Connecticut. And finally, remember that the center is here for you year-round with the dynamic programming, support services, case management, and more. And you can find out more about all of our upcoming programs at newhavenpridecenter.org. Finally, don't forget to follow us on social media, including at New Haven Pride Center on Facebook and Instagram, and at New Haven Pride on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And finally, please consider joining us as a member because it's free at newhavenpridecenter.org/join now. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight. Feel free to email any of us with your questions, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Take care, everyone.